This is the map that you are probably familiar with, right? It's called the Mercator Projection, and it's been widely used since its creation in 1569. But what if I told you that it's wrong? By the way, stick around to the end of this video to find out what I think is the best alternative. But why is this one wrong? Well, as we know, the Earth is a sphere. Well, pretty much. And it's physically impossible to project any image accurately from a sphere onto a flat surface with complete accuracy. There's always going to be some kind of distortion which affects the way the image looks. No matter how hard we try, and trust me, we have tried, it can't be done. You can see it here on the truesize.com. As I move the countries around, you can see them warping and distorting depending on whereabouts we put them. A common example that's always used is Greenland. Look at it on the Mercator projection. It's huge. It's about the same size as Africa, or at least it looks that way. The reality is very different. Here we can see there's actually no comparison whatsoever. Africa is so much bigger. It's actually about 14 times bigger than Greenland. So why is this the map that we all recognize? Well, it's said that the Mercator projection was originally used for navigation purposes for sailors traveling across the ocean. Let's look at a more modern example of this to see how it works in action. If you've ever been on a plane and you see the map on the screen that's tracking your path, you'll notice that it seems like you're traveling on a curve rather than on a straight line. That's because you're looking at a flat, two-dimensional map. Without getting too complex, the Mercator projection provides the correct coordinates to ensure the quickest route from A to B, which in reality is of course a straight line. But when you project that path onto a flat surface, it becomes a curve. Sailors navigating the ocean. Now this is where Jane Elliott comes in. Elliott is a diversity educator and anti-racism activist, and she says the Pope commissioned Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator to produce a map that shows the spread of Christianity. So immediately this changes what we're looking at. We're not looking at a map which was designed to have any practical function whatsoever, but rather the result of almost a power project. The larger countries are the ones where Christianity had a stronghold. They were seen as the significant ones. They reflected the civilized culture of Christianity. So the whole thing almost served as some kind of ego trip. Now, I'll be honest, I can't find any hard evidence which supports this claim. If you can, please let me know in the comments. We're all here to learn together, of course. But either way, the question still remains. Why today in the 21st century is this what we see in our heads when we think of a world map? We already know it's not accurate, at least no more accurate than the many alternatives. And with GPS tracking every square inch of the planet, we no longer rely on it for navigation. Well, Jane Elliott may well have a point. It's long been said that the Mercator projection plays into colonialist ideology, making Africa much smaller in comparison to the US and Europe, which are seen as a lot bigger than they should be. Also, we can see Europe as being almost directly in the center, which, as I will show you later on, isn't the case. The Atlantic slave trade began in 1526 when the Portuguese took people out of West Africa and moved them to Brazil. So 1526. Put a pin in that, because just 43 years later, in 1569, the Mercator projection was drawn up. So the idea of colonialism and global travel was well underway. Those navigating sailors I mentioned earlier were mostly made up of Europeans traveling along colonial trade routes, of course taking Christianity to Africa. So let's go back and say that the Pope did commission this map to track the spread of Christianity. This all seems to give Jane Elliott's theory a little bit more weight. We know that the powers that be use propaganda all the time to encourage people to think in a certain way. It's been that way throughout history. So long as there's been a thirst for power and domination, there's the need for manipulation. So let's look a bit more into the Mercator projection to see if we can find any patterns. This is the truesize.com, and it's going to give us a better idea of what's actually going on here. Remember, this image itself is not accurate, but what you're about to see is. So there's no arguing that Africa is pretty big, but let's take the Democratic Republic of Congo. If we move it over to where America is, we can see that it's almost half the size of mainland USA. In fact, you could pretty much fit the whole of the USA into the Sahara Desert alone. And now let's look over at Russia. Undeniably massive. Or is it? Well, in actual fact, Russia fits comfortably inside Africa. We can even add mainland USA into there with room to spare. How much room to spare, you ask? Well, let's go ahead and stick most of Europe in there. So what do all these have in common? Well, they're all what you might call political superpowers. And judging by the Mercator projection, it's very easy to see why. They apparently take up so much of the world's landmass that we're encouraged to see them as the most dominant, imposing cultures. But this map was made in the 16th century. What relevance did Russia have on the world stage back then? Well, bear with me. Let's assume that the Mercator projection was in fact the map that was chosen at the time because it presented a distorted worldview of colonial powers. The sense of importance and patriotism of being bigger and better than the uncivilized land of Africa, there's definitely going to be a lot of this in this video, could have quickly become central to the way Americans and Europeans saw their place in the world. This is something that has persisted throughout generations, particularly in America. So is it possible then that as other countries began to gain more wealth much later on, they began to think in the same way? Look at how big we are. We need to have more money, a bigger military, a greater influence on world politics, to the point of where we are today, where the Mercator projection pretty much reflects the modern geopolitical landscape. It's almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So is there a way to show a more accurate size of the countries in comparison to each other? Well, yeah, it's called the gall-peters projection. Although as we can see, the shapes are distorted. As I said at the start, there will always be some kind of distortion. It's just physically impossible to project a 3D image onto a 2D surface without some kind of distortion. So although we can now see the accurate size of the continents in relation to each other, we've traded off the accuracy of the shapes. But straight away, we can see the differences. Africa is huge. Just look how small Europe and the USA are in comparison, even to South America. Suddenly, this starts to make a lot more sense. And just look how much further north Europe is. The gall-peters projection was originally developed in 1855, but didn't really gain much traction until it was revived by journalist Arno Peters in the early 1970s. And he claimed that the eurocentric view of the world that we see in the Mercator projection was deliberate, and essentially it was serving its purpose in preserving the power and perceptions of richer nations, and that his map shows a much truer vision of equality between all of us as human beings. Now, this is just a theory on my part, but don't you think if this was the map that we all knew like the back of our hands, there would have been more questions asked over the centuries about why the Western world was allowed to have such dominance over world politics and culture? It must be said that in recent years the gall-peters projection has become a bit more popular. It's currently endorsed by UNESCO and is apparently now being taught in some British schools. It's a good step. But yes, as I said, there is no true depiction of the globe without distortion. Every map reflects part of the truth, but never all of it. So I guess the real question is, what do we need from our maps? Like when we're teaching them in schools, what's the most important message we want to send out? Because outside of a nautical context, the Mercator projection provides no real value other than preserving outdated ideas and attitudes. The gall-peters projection, however, can reshape all of this, literally. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out the impact that Africans had on the Roman Empire. I'll see you there.